The Box NYC is one of New York's most exclusive nightclubs. This is from the New York Times. The Box's place in New York nightlife was predicated on the idea that it was the antidote to every other hotspot. Neither money nor connections alone would guarantee entry, though celebrity helped. Now, the Gumball 3000. It is a similar level of exclusivity. It's a driving rally where you drive 3,000 miles in a week. There is an entrance fee of $150,000. This was many years ago. And so now I'm sure it's more. Especially during that time, many years ago, it was popular mostly among celebrities and very successful entrepreneurs and trust fund kids. And it usually doesn't stop in the United States, but back in 2010, that's when this story is from. Back in 2010, it had its second half of the event, of the under 1 week event on the North American continent. This was its route, 3,000 miles in 7 days. We ended up doing it years later. We got in a different way, but this was way before we did it. This was before we did it. It had a route where it started in Europe. It started in London, then they drove to Amsterdam, then Copenhagen, and then all of the cars flew to North America, and they drove from Montreal to Toronto, and then they ended in New York. But as it drove, as the Gumball 3000, as the Gumball Rally, as people call it, drove from Toronto to New York City, it had one of its very famous parties. Every party on the route, everyone wants to attend these parties because they know top people will show up. Famous people will show up. Well-known heads of industry will show up. And they had one of these parties in Boston, which is where I was going to school at the time. I was going to college in Boston in 2010. The Gumball stopped there. I didn't really care about the Gumball. One of my best friends loved the Gumball. And so him and I, we went to go film at the party. We went to film outside the party. We weren't let into the party. We went to go film outside the party, and we filmed the cars. The Gumball 3000, it's done by these crazy supercars. Lamborghinis, Ferraris. I mean, I'm not much of a car fanatic, which if you looked at my history with cars, that comes as a big surprise to people because I've done some crazy things with driving in cars. I'm not much of a car fanatic, but my friend was, and we went to go film the supercars, and then we gave the footage to the Gumball 3000 staff. We sent it to them. But we weren't let into the party despite this. We couldn't go to the party. However, I did notice one thing. I noticed that all of the Gumball 3000 people were wearing these black wristbands with silver writing that said Gumball 3000. That was what I noticed. Everyone had these wristbands. Everyone on the Gumball had these wristbands. And when I got back to my college dorm room, I Googled it and I saw that there were indeed these identifying wristbands associated with the Gumball. And then after that, I think it was the next day or the day after, I took the train home from Boston to New York. I rode the train home. I think it was 2 days. It was 2 days later. And I came back to New York City. And that night in New York City, the Gumball 3000 was having its final party of the event in New York City. And you know where it was having its party? It was having its party in the Box. In the Box, one of New York City's most exclusive nightclubs, was having a party for one of the most exclusive driving events and just events in the world at the time. And I wanted to go. Obviously, I wasn't attending the Gumball and I couldn't go to the party. I wasn't allowed. I was a dumb kid. I didn't have any connections. I wasn't famous, but I wanted to go to this party. And I had a crazy idea that maybe I could make one of these wristbands. And so I said, I'm going to do this. I went to an arts and crafts store. In my neighborhood, and I got this material that kind of looked like what the wristband looked like in real life. And I bought a silver pen. It's so funny. And then I cut out a long, thin line of the material. I wrapped it around my wrist and I wrote Gumball 3000 on it. I tried to get my friend to come. My friend was back in New York. He is also from this area. He was too nervous. So I went by myself. My friend was going to come and then he got too nervous. I went by myself. This reminded me of another story that I can share on this episode. episode 76 of The Edward Show. And so I show up to the box, New York, and I think it was around like 10 p.m. And I was afraid that I was getting there late. I didn't know anything about nightlife. I really was, I was so clueless at the time. I didn't know anything about nightlife, and I thought 10 p.m. was late. I thought I'd be arriving like at the end of the party or something. But there's no one there. This is where, like, I knew that the party was here because I read like gossip magazines. I didn't read them regularly. I was Googling. And so I saw there were some gossip magazines saying like this is where the party was going to be. And so I show up and there are these door guys. It's the best clubs in New York. They will have very hidden entrances. You can't really tell that these are clubs. You can only tell during the night because there will be a velvet rope outside of the clubs and big bodyguards and big security guys. And so I show up to these security guys and I show up to the velvet rope and I say kind of like just not really sure if this is the right place. And I say, hey, I have this bracelet. I have this wristband. And I show them, I just lift up my arm and they immediately see the wristband that I made in the afternoon with Gumball 3000 written on it with silver like Sharpie that I bought. They go, oh, he has a wristband. He has a wristband. Let him in. They lift the velvet rope and I go right on in. And you think, oh, he did it. Edward did it. But no, I get inside and it's empty. There's nobody there. And I think I'm in the wrong spot, or like this is some random bar and it's just not popular. And like, I didn't know anything. I didn't know that the Box New York was the Box New York. I didn't know it was this hot spot. I didn't know anything. I didn't know if I was in the right place. And I get a drink and I say, well, maybe I'm like texting, trying to figure out if I'm in the right spot. And after 15 minutes, I'm standing at the bar and I look to my left and then Exhibit is there. The guy from Pimp My Ride. He's standing right next to me. And I'm like, oh my God, this must be the right place. And slowly it started to fill up and then it got crazy. I ended up in a stripper booth. I was 19. I was so dumb. I was clueless. No connections. I was a college kid. I ended up in a stripper booth with all these people and then Tony Hawk across from me in the booth. It was so wild. Such a wild event. And I left at like 2:15 a.m., which now I realize is very early, but I was tired and I'm sure the party went on for 2, 3, 4 more hours after that, knowing what I know now. But at the time, I thought I was leaving like at the end of the event. And I made connections there that I still have to this day. So this episode 75 of The Edward Show, this episode is about social engineering. It's not the typical go-to-market or marketing episode of The Edward Show that I normally tell. But I think there is power in getting access to amazing people. So that's what this episode is about. It's if you have no access, here's some of the ways that I got access when I had no access. And this access to amazing people got me connections that I still have today. And I want to say there's a caveat, like these stories are fun, but you can also just sit at home and get really good at making amazing content. And then amazing people will reach out to you and be your friend too. That's happening to me with TikTok. And that's happening to me with this podcast. As I get better at making these podcasts, as I get better at making videos on TikTok, I have more impressive people reaching out to me and then they want to introduce me to their impressive friends and I get access that way. It's a more meritocratic way to get access, which is to get really good at something and have people know you for that thing. But in lieu of that, sneaking into nightclubs, at the very least, it makes for some fun stories. And that's what I'm going to be telling on this episode. So I got into that event and it really was such a wild event. And I met this head of a production company. We're still friends. He took me days later. He took me to Soho House. That was my first time going to Soho House. And I was a kid. It was, I made all these connections. It was very cool. And then when I graduated college, I realized that I wanted to be more of an insider in the New York scene. I came back to live in New York City and I kept hearing about nightlife and what was going on. And you always hear about that growing up in New York. And when I was in school in New York City, when I was growing up in New York, I was an outsider. I was a loser and I didn't fit in. Now, here's the thing about the New York City clubs. Even insiders in New York who are growing up, when they graduate from school and they become adults, many of them can't even get into these clubs. These clubs are really just the most exclusive places. Like, here is the types. This is the type of access that you get in these clubs. You meet models, famous athletes, famous actors and musicians. You meet captains of industries, really accomplished entrepreneurs, and like so much more. And everyone's there to have a good time. And so when I graduated from college, I wanted to be on the inside. I was never really on the inside. I wanted to do that. Even when I was in college and I was starting to do like big viral stunts, I wasn't an insider. I was still like a weirdo. Like the people who do the big viral stunts, those are weirdos. Those are standouts. It takes a standout to do something that crazy that goes viral. And so I was a standout. I was an outsider, and I wanted to be an insider. But this was before I was working in New York City nightclubs. So there came to be a point where I had access to these clubs, and I was going to them very, very regularly. And this was before that. So I'm going to tell stories. I'm going to tell a story of how I used to sneak into these clubs quite regularly. I used to sneak into these clubs. And it started, I would hear about places to go and places to try, and I would go with my friends, and I made new friends who were willing to take chances. And me and my friends were willing to take chances. We would show up to some of these places that we read were very exclusive. And indeed they were. They wouldn't let us in. And we got turned away from so many of these nightclubs. And we would stand outside sad that we weren't let in. And then we would see like Leonardo DiCaprio leaving with, 5 models, or we would see The Weeknd walk in. We would see Kanye West walk into these places that we couldn't get into. And we stood outside. We're like, how do we get in there? And I figured something out. Here's what I figured out. It took a while for me to start doing this, but there came a point when I would get rejected, and then I would say, you know what happened? Let me tell you what happened. I remember now. I read How to Win Friends and Influence People, and then I reread it. And it was a second reading that was the most potent. And the second reading stresses like, get people's names. Somebody's name is the sweetest sound to their ears. Get people's names. Oh my gosh, this is a great, great story. And so, this is so funny. And so we would get turned away from these clubs. And then after a while, I started asking the doormen for their names. Now, the doormen of these clubs, New York City nightclubs is very different from clubs around the world. Clubs, if you're a new listener to the show, I spend most of my time now outside the United States. I spend most of my time traveling through Europe. And in Europe, nightclubs and bars, it's extremely different. Exclusivity is just paying for the entrance fee into one of these clubs in Europe. That's what exclusivity is about. Exclusivity, even in Berghain, which is like one of the most exclusive clubs in Europe, it's bringing this like right vibe. But in New York, you need to have connections, or you need to be famous, or you need to be really beautiful. And that's how you get, or you need to be wealthy and willing to pay a super high entrance fee, like over $1,000. And that's how you get into these clubs in New York. And that's why they're so vetted. That's why the people inside them are so top notch. It's very different than it is in Europe and other places in the world. Clubs in New York, very different. And these doormen are the people who decide who comes into the clubs and who stays out. They will frequently go back into the clubs to make sure the mix is right inside, and then they will go stand outside looking all mean, surrounded by their bodyguards who will push people away who are not let in. And there's a lot of drunk people who come to these clubs, they're not let in, and they'll try to get violent, and then these huge bodyguards will just stand in front of them and they'll cower down and walk away with their tails between their legs. So after getting turned away myself many times, and I was always sober for this, I never drank going to these clubs. I realized that if I started with one drug, it could lead to more, and I was very aware of that. So I never drank or did drugs when I was going to these clubs. I have friends who did. I don't have anything against it, but I did not. I would go sober. I wouldn't get let in because I would look like a dork. Clearly, I wouldn't know what was going on. I didn't have these connections. And so I got the bright idea from reading How to Win Friends and Influence People to ask doormen for their names after getting rejected. So someone would say, sorry, guest list only. And I'd be like, oh, man. All right. Well, thanks anyway. What's your name? And then they'd give me their names. Oh, my name's Frank. My name's Eddie. My name's Dave. And I'd say, well, Dave, nice to meet you. Thanks again. And I'd be like, you too. And then I'd walk away, and I have an app on my phone, Simple Note. I think it was purchased by Microsoft, this app. I started a list of all the doormen in New York City who I met and who turned me away, and I wrote down their names and what they looked like. And then a week later, maybe like 4 days later, I would show up at one of these clubs, And then I would be like, Dave, my man, what's up? And Dave would look at me and he would recognize me because he had turned me away a few days before. But because I was so entitled with him, he would think he recognized me because we knew each other in a positive way. So he didn't realize that he recognized me because he turned me away because I was being so friendly and knew his name. He thought he recognized me because we were friends, and we would shake hands, and I'd be like, yo, Dave, it's me and my friend. He'd be like, come on in. We would go to these clubs. And then by going to the clubs so often, then I would become friends with these doormen, the kings of these clubs, and then they would start letting me in regularly. And that's how I started getting to know people in the New York City nightlife scene. And I totally social engineered that. And I got access to all the people that I described. I was meeting these athletes. I was meeting these musicians. I was meeting these models. I was meeting these heads of industries. And it was amazing. It was an amazing time. And that's how I became, I guess that's how I became an insider. I have one more story. This story occurred to me only as I was telling the first story during the podcast about the Gumball 3000. This is a short story, but this was when I was in college in Boston. I wanted to go to the rooftop of one of the tallest buildings in Boston. They used to allow people up on this roof. And then after 9/11, they stopped allowing people up on this roof. And so I was a crazy college kid. I sent the management company for the building an email, and I said, hey, I'm going to film school in Boston. We have a budget, and we're looking to make a film. We're looking to shoot a scene on top of a tall building in Boston. Can we come look at your roof? And the only reason I did this was I wanted to see the view from one of these buildings. There were no buildings at the time, no tall buildings in Boston at the time where you could go up to the top. In New York City, you can go to the observation deck on the Empire State Building and other buildings. In Boston, you couldn't do that. I had been going to school in Boston for years. I wanted to see what Boston looked like from the sky. And I sent this email, and they're like, yeah, well, I'll show you around. You're a kid from college. We know this college, and it's a well-known film school. And I wanted to bring the same friend who was afraid to come to the Gumball party with me. He was gonna come to this rooftop with me, and then he got nervous. And so I show up alone with a camera. I say, yeah, we're thinking about making this movie here. There was no movie, but in my head, I had planned everything in case I was ready to lie. And then I got shown the top of this exclusive office tower in Boston, tall office tower in Boston. Like one of the owners of the building, who's so nice, took me to the top, and I got to take pictures, and I had a view that nobody else gets in Boston. And that was a really cool and memorable moment. It was getting to see the city like that. So I think that was kind of an example of social engineering, or maybe it was just an example of lying. I don't know. These stories they bleed into each other. There's a lot of lying involved. There's a lot of fibbing involved, but they're fun. I was a young kid being in those clubs because I was also making viral videos during the day. I was making crazy videos, but that's a story for another episode. I hope you enjoyed episode 76 of The Edward Show. These are fun stories. I like telling them. This is my daily podcast. I have this podcast so I can tell stories like this, because I have many of them, so many of them. Honestly, each story could be its own episode. I could go deep into one story, but I thought it would be fun to make this episode about social engineering and how to get access to all sorts of people that you might not have access to. So I hope you enjoyed this. It's a beautiful, beautiful, gorgeous afternoon here in New York. I wish you could see these skies. They're so blue. The air is so crisp. It's so nice. And I have vanilla coffee sitting on my desk. And now I have the privilege of getting to edit this episode so it sounds good for all of you to listen to. I am in the zone. I'm going to make a TikTok after this. Oh my God, it's going to be a great day. And yeah, let me know if you enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to all of you again tomorrow. Bye now.